The hinge was wrong. That was the first thing Vareth Sol noticed when she reviewed the security footage from the east corridor of the Meridian Conclave's diplomatic wing. Not the intruder, not the breach, not even the moment her life had come within a breath of ending. It was the hinge on door 7. The blast-reinforced, molecularly bonded, supposedly immovable hinge on door 7. It had been bent, not cut, not melted, not forced with mechanical leverage or powered exosuit assistance. Bent by hand. The footage was grainy, the angle poor, the lighting degraded from the earlier power interruption. But the shape of the human's grip was unmistakable. Fingers wrapped around cold durasteel in a corridor where the atmosphere itself had been partially vented, where the temperature had dropped low enough to crystallize organic tissue, and he had gripped that hinge and he had pulled. Vareth Sol watched the footage 4 more times before she understood she was not going to understand it. Then she called him into her office. His name was Marcus Hale, and the first thing most species noticed about him was that he did not look dangerous. This was, she would come to understand, the single most important thing about him. He was medium height by human standards, which placed him a full head shorter than Vareth Sol's Yanari frame. His body carried none of the visible modifications that the galaxy's premium security contractors typically advertised. No subdermal plating, no enhanced optical implants glowing at the iris, no military-grade exoframe bolted to his shoulders. He wore a plain gray jacket. He kept his hands in his pockets. He had a face that looked like it had been used for purposes a face wasn't designed for, and he had said almost nothing in the 9 days since she'd hired him. What she had noticed and filed away with the precision her species was known for was that he had not slept more than 3 hours on any of those 9 days. She had reviewed the biometric log. The numbers were there in quiet black digits, absolutely certain of themselves. He had been awake, watching, apparently without any particular urgency about it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He did not shift. He did not adjust. He simply occupied the chair the way a stone occupies a riverbed, like the chair had always contained him and always would. "The door," she said, "needed to be open. The molecular bonding on that hinge is rated for. I know what it's rated for." Silence. Outside her window, the orbital ring of the Meridian Conclave rotated through its slow ceremony of light and bureaucracy. 3 of the Yanari Compact's most senior council members were in this building. 17 ongoing diplomatic accords depended on their continued biological function. The Kareth Syndicate had already made 2 attempts in as many months, and Marcus Hale was looking at her the way a person looks at a puzzle they have already solved and are simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "I need to understand what you are," she said. "Before tonight's summit, I need to understand what I have hired." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. More like the shadow a smile leaves behind when it passes. "I'm a bodyguard," he said. "You bent a molecularly bonded hinge with your bare hands in a vented corridor at -40 degrees. "You're alive," he said. She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them moved. This was the moment, though she would not recognize it as such until much, much later, when the first question embedded itself into her like a splinter. Not how had he done it, not why. The question that truly lodged and refused to leave was simpler and somehow more disturbing than either of those. What else had he done that she hadn't seen on any footage at all? The Yanari did not hire human security contractors as a rule. This was not discrimination in the legal sense. It was simply logic, and the Yanari were extraordinarily proud of their logic. Humans were new. Humans were unverified. Humans came from a single-system civilization with no galactic combat record, no conclave-certified combat ratings, no independent biometric assessments of threat potential. When the Galactic Security Brokers Exchange published its annual Species Capability Index, the document that most major diplomatic entities use to select their protective staff, humans did not appear on it at all. Not at the bottom, not with an asterisk, not with a footnote, not on it. Vareth Sol had hired Marcus Hale for 2 reasons. The first was that every certified contractor from every rated species was already allocated. The Kareth Syndicate's pressure campaign had been methodical enough that it had quietly, professionally cornered the market on available security talent before the summit was even announced. The second reason was a name. A single name, given to her by a source she trusted more than she trusted most governments. Shan Keth of the Drively Collective. Shan Keth had survived a Kareth assassination using a human bodyguard. The bodyguard had not been injured. The Kareth operatives, 6 of them, 2 with combat-grade cybernetic augmentation, had not survived at all. The report had been buried. Shan Keth did not speak publicly about what had happened. When Vareth Sol had finally reached her through 3 layers of diplomatic encryption and asked directly, there had been a long silence before Shan Keth said, "Find the human. Keep him between you and whatever is coming. Do not ask him to explain himself. You will not understand the explanation." That had been the second mystery, not what Marcus Hale could do, but why someone who had survived what Shan Keth survived was unwilling to describe it. The third mystery had arrived later quietly while Vareth Sol was reviewing Hale's background documentation. She was thorough. She reviewed everything. And what she found, or more precisely, what she didn't find, had kept her awake for 2 nights in a row despite her species' typical emotional regulation. His service record was real. The verification codes checked out. The Terran Defense Authority had confirmed his service, confirmed his discharge, confirmed his awards. But there was a gap. 7 years in the middle of his record, classified at a tier she didn't have access to, redacted not by her own government standards but by Earth's, using a cipher lock she had never seen any human document use before. 7 years in the most active period of his career. 7 years of nothing. She had hired a human who may or may not have spent 7 years doing something his own species wouldn't put on paper. Tonight's summit had 42 diplomatic personnel, 17 security staff, and 1 man in a gray jacket standing near the east corridor door, which now had a replaced hinge, installed at his specific request with a lighter alloy. She had asked why. He had said, "Faster to break if I need to." The summit began at standard hour 19 and proceeded with the careful, glacial dignity that all conclave diplomatic events maintained by design. The architecture of the room was old and intentional, curved walls that carried sound, open sightlines, no alcoves, no staging areas, every surface scanned and ray-scanned. The Yanari security team, 12 individuals, each certified, each credentialed, each with clean combat records and predictable threat profiles, occupied their designated positions with textbook precision. Marcus Hale stood near the east corridor and looked slightly bored. The Kareth Syndicate's representative, a smooth and charming individual named Torith Van, opened the summit with a proposal that was reasonable on its surface and devastating in its implications. A resource-sharing accord that would require the Yanari Compact to withdraw inspection rights from 3 border systems. Torith Van smiled throughout the presentation. He had a smile that seemed structurally engineered to suggest that disagreement was an intellectual failure. Vareth Sol did not look at Torith Van. She watched the perimeter. She watched Hale. For 6 hours, 6 hours of measured diplomatic combat, of counter-proposals and veiled threats and careful silences, she kept one eye on the negotiations and one eye on the man in the gray jacket. He did not shift his position. He did not check any visible device. He did not speak. He watched the room the way a surgeon watches a monitor, not with anxiety, but with a precise, detached, absolutely total attention that she found increasingly difficult to look at directly. At hour 6, something changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the air, a micro-variation in the ambient vibration of the station, the kind of change that the Yanari sensory apparatus was designed to detect and that most other species missed entirely. She started to rise. Hale was already moving, not running, not in any way that would register as alarming to the room. He was walking, but walking the way a thrown object travels, with a certainty of trajectory that made the movement feel faster than it was. He crossed the room in 8 seconds. He was between Vareth Sol and the east corridor door before she had fully processed that she needed to move. The door came open. 3 individuals entered, combat rated, augmented. moving with the compressed efficiency of people who had done this before and expected to finish quickly. What happened next lasted approximately 40 seconds. She would later spend a considerable amount of time trying to reconstruct those 40 seconds from memory, from the available footage, from the accounts of the 12 certified Yanari security personnel who had been present. She would struggle. Not because the events were unclear, but because the events kept resisting the framework she used to interpret them. The first operative was incapacitated before he had completed his entry movement. She did not see how. The camera angle caught only the result, a figure folded at an angle that implied several simultaneous structural failures, deposited against the wall with a kind of controlled finality, like a decision rather than a collision. The second operative raised a directed energy weapon. This was the moment the footage became genuinely difficult to parse, because what Hale did was not dodge. It was something that looked like stepping forward into the weapon's discharge path, which made no physical sense, except that by the time the discharge occurred he was no longer in it. He had continued moving through a geometry that the camera's frame rate rendered as a visual anomaly, a smear, a human-shaped absence where a human had just been. The third operative stopped moving on their own. This was the detail that would disturb Verath Sol the most in subsequent weeks, not what had happened to the first two, but the third one, who had looked at whatever was happening in that room and had made a choice. The entire certified Yanari security team had been mobilizing throughout this sequence. They arrived at the East Corridor, 12 trained, credentialed, rated individuals, approximately 6 seconds after the third operative had ceased to be a problem. Hale was standing in the corridor, breathing slightly elevated, otherwise unremarkable. "Clear," he said. One of the Yanari security officers, a veteran named Keleth Dren, decorated, experienced, not given to fanciful interpretation, looked at the scene, looked at Hale, and then did something Verath Sol had never seen Keleth Dren do in 11 years of professional acquaintance. He took one step backward. Later that night, alone in her secured quarters with the summit postponed and the political aftermath beginning its slow, grinding machinery, Verath Sol reviewed the Galactic Security Brokers Exchange Index again. She searched not for human contractors. She already knew they weren't listed. She searched for something else. She searched for the evaluation criteria, the methodology, what the index actually measured when it ranked a species' security capability, threat profile. Augmentation Index. Combat record meaning formal documented engagements between recognized military structures. Biological parameters, strength, speed, sensory acuity, natural armor rating. Psychological Stability Index, which measured response under threat conditions and specifically valued the absence of erratic or unpredictable behavior. The index penalized unpredictability. She read that line 3 times. The index penalized unpredictability because every security model in Galactic Conclave doctrine was built on the assumption that effective protection required consistent, projectable behavior, that a bodyguard who could be understood was a bodyguard who could be trusted, deployed, and most importantly, replaced. Species that registered as psychologically stable were ranked higher. Species that behaved in ways that varied significantly under extreme stress, that escalated rather than retreated, that increased aggression proportional to threat level rather than modulating it, that displayed what the index called irrational persistence patterns under losing conditions, were scored lower. Humanity had not been excluded from the index because it was new. It had been excluded because, when the preliminary evaluation team ran the initial human behavioral profile through the ranking algorithm, the algorithm had returned an error code. She found this buried in an administrative footnote she had to specifically request to access. The error code had been logged, the evaluation team had moved on, and the incident had been quietly filed under methodology edge cases. Nobody had gone back to ask what the error actually meant. She went back. The error code was simple. Subject behavioral profile exceeds threat escalation parameters, upper bound undefined. Humanity hadn't scored low. The system hadn't known where to put them. She sat with that for a very long time. Then she called Marcus Hale. He answered on the second ring, which meant he wasn't sleeping, which meant she checked the timestamp. He hadn't slept in 19 hours. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The third one, tonight." Third operative stopped on their own. A pause, not a long one. "Yes," he said. "What did they see?" Another pause, longer. "Me," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give you that's actually true," she pressed. "What are you, Marcus? Not a bodyguard. I know that's not the whole answer. The 7 years in your record, the redacted years, I've been trying to understand what you were doing." Silence stretched between them across the encrypted line. "I was learning," he finally said. "Learning what?" "How to stop things from getting worse." A beat. "I wasn't always very good at it." The way he said that last sentence, quiet, factual, carrying a weight that the words themselves were too small to contain, told her something she had not been prepared to know. The 7 blank years were not classified because what he had done was secret. They were classified because the documentation of what he had survived, what he had done to survive it, what the situations had been in order to require the things he'd done, that documentation was dangerous to the psychological stability of anyone who read it. She had not hired a bodyguard. She had hired the residue of something her civilization had no name for. "Get some sleep," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. "After the next sweep," he said, and disconnected. She sat in the dark, turning the conversation over in her mind, and the question that had lodged like a splinter on the first day drove itself a little deeper. What else had he done that she hadn't seen? The answer arrived 17 days later from a source she had not expected, the Kareth Syndicate itself. Torith Van requested a private meeting, not through official channels. Through a coded diplomatic back route that implied the conversation was not on behalf of the Syndicate's leadership, but rather about them. This distinction, offered with the kind of subtle precision that only very frightened people deployed, told Vareth Saul more than anything in the message itself. She brought Hale. She sat him in the corner. Torith Van arrived and spent approximately 3 seconds looking at Hale before his famously engineered smile showed its first visible crack. "He needs to leave," Torith Van said. "He stays," she said. Torith Van considered this with the expression of a man recalculating distances. Then he sat down. "The operation at the summit," he said. "Your operation," she agreed. "We have lost contact with all 3 participants. I'm aware." "We have lost contact," he paused, and she watched him choose words with the care of someone diffusing something, "with the individuals who planned the operation." She went still. "That's a different statement." "Yes." Torith Van's eyes moved briefly to Hale, moved away. "We are attempting to understand how a response at the point of execution could have reached backward through our operational chain to—" "It didn't," Hale said. Both of them looked at him. He hadn't moved from the corner. "Your planners contacted someone after the summit failed," Hale said. "That someone had a connection to a network that had a prior arrangement I was already aware of. The chain collapsed from a different direction. Nothing reached backward from me to them." A pause. This time, Torith Van stared at him with an expression Vareth Saul had never seen on the face of a Kareth diplomat before. It took her a moment to identify it. Terror was too dramatic a word. It was something more precise and therefore more disturbing. It was the look of someone who had built a very complicated model of how reality worked, and was now watching one of the model's foundational assumptions quietly fail. "What are you?" Torith Van said. "She asked me the same thing," Hale said. He looked at Vareth Saul. "I gave her the same answer." "Which was, bodyguard." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples it made were all wrong, too wide, too deep, spreading past the edges of the conversation into territory none of them had maps for. Torith Van left shortly after. He did not smile on his way out. Vareth Saul turned to Hale. "You knew about their network before the summit," she said. "Yes." "And you let the summit proceed anyway. You needed the attempt to fail publicly. A quiet prevention wouldn't have changed the political math. You needed them to move, commit resources, expose the connection between Torith Van and the operational side. The summit was the bait. The room was very quiet. "I was the bait," she said. "You were the protected asset." His voice did not change. "I knew what was coming. I knew when. I knew how many. I knew what they were carrying. And you said nothing to me. If you'd known, you would have behaved differently." The read would have changed, the attempt would have aborted, you'd still be exposed with no evidence and no leverage. He held her gaze. This way you have both. She sat with that. The anger was real. The recognition that he was correct was also real and more uncomfortable. How long have you been doing this? She said, not as an accusation, as a genuine question, because she was beginning to understand that the answer was going to be something she hadn't prepared for. He considered the question with a care that suggested it required more precision than it appeared to. My whole life, he said, in one form or another. The 7 years were the form where I did it without rules. She thought about what that meant for a long time after he left the room. The summit reconvened 3 weeks later. The political landscape had shifted. The Karath Syndicate's internal structure was under conclave investigation. Torith Van had quietly resigned his position, and 3 previously neutral compact members had aligned with Yanari proposals in ways that restructured the entire negotiating dynamic. What had been a position of managed retreat had become, unexpectedly, a position of strength. None of this was in any official account attributed to the presence of a human bodyguard. But things moved through diplomatic circles the way water moved through stone, not through force but through time, through contact, through the slow dissolution of surfaces. Verath Sol began receiving inquiries. Quiet ones, the kind that didn't go through official channels. Other diplomatic entities, Yanari adjacent, then not, who had heard something, who knew someone who had spoken to Shan Keth of the Drively Collective, who had seen the Meridian footage or heard the story or simply noticed that the Karath Syndicate had stopped moving against a particular set of targets. The inquiries always asked variations of the same question. Where did you find him? She always asked Hale before she answered, because she had learned slowly, empirically, through a series of small recalibrations to her understanding of what she was dealing with, that he was aware of things before she expected him to be aware of them, and that consulting him before acting was simply a better epistemic practice. When she told him about the inquiries, he was quiet for a moment. How many? He said. 7 as of this morning. He nodded slowly, not as if he was surprised, as if he was counting something. What are you counting? She asked. Pressure points, he said. The syndicate isn't done, they're going to change the approach. Individual action is too visible, they'll move to something distributed, slower, harder to trace. He looked at her. 7 diplomatic entities asking about me means 7 diplomatic entities the syndicate is going to examine for new angles. I've made you more visible by existing. Then why? She started. Because the alternative was letting the original plan succeed, he said. And then there's no summit, no compact, no leverage. There's a funeral and a political vacuum the syndicate fills inside of 6 months. She absorbed this. You think about futures. I think about chains, he said. Action, response, counter-response. You project the chain forward, you see where it ends. Most of the time the chain ends somewhere manageable. Sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, he looked out the window at the orbital ring, the station's slow rotation, the distant starfields, the geometry of a civilization that had been building on itself for thousands of years. Then you change where the chain starts, he said, even if that costs you something. She thought about the hinge, about a corridor at -40 degrees, about a man who had apparently entered that corridor knowing exactly what was on the other side and gripped a molecularly bonded hinge with bare hands and pulled. Does it cost you, she said, actually cost you because you never seem. It costs, he said, quietly. Finally, how much? He turned from the window. His face was the same face it always was, used, patient, carrying things that didn't show on surfaces. You'll know, he said, if we get to the part where I have to show you. They got to that part 4 months later. The syndicate's new approach, as Hale had projected, was distributed. Not operatives with weapons but information. A specifically constructed intelligence operation designed to surface details about Verath Sol's diplomatic methods that, in the wrong framing, would constitute treaty violations. The goal was not her physical death but her political death, which was in some respects harder to protect against. Hale's response was not what she expected. He disappeared for 11 days. No communication. No location data. The biometric tracker she was technically required to maintain on contracted security personnel returned 11 days of null, not offline, not destroyed. Null. As if whatever he was doing existed in a space the tracker was not designed to follow. On the 12th day, he was sitting in her office when she arrived in the morning. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. "I should have been informed," she said. "You would have tried to stop me," he said. "Or you would have tried to help, which would have made it harder." "Harder to do what?" He put something on her desk. A data chip, old format, physical medium, the kind that couldn't be remotely accessed or intercepted. "Everything the syndicate compiled on you," he said. "Every source they used, every channel it was going to move through, every entity they'd already briefed." He paused. "And the primary architect of the operation." She looked at the chip. "This took 11 days." "Yes. Alone." A fractional pause. "Mostly. Where did you go?" He was quiet for a moment. "3 systems. One of them doesn't have a conclave name yet." She sat down. She was very careful about how she sat down because the vertigo of the moment required some counterweight of physical deliberateness. "Are you injured?" she said. "I'll be fine." "That's not what I asked." He considered this. He seemed to be doing arithmetic. "Left side," he said. "Minor." She called the medical team over his objection, quiet, persistent objection, in the particular tone he used when he had already decided he wasn't going to win an argument but was going to document his position for the record. The medic spent 20 minutes with him. When she came out, she found Verath Saul and stopped walking for a moment. "The scarring," the medic said. "On his left side. There's already extensive prior scarring there. Multiple generations of it. I don't want to pry into his history, but—" "How extensive?" Verath Saul said. The medic looked at her with an expression Verath Saul was beginning to recognize as the face people made when Marcus Hale had just rearranged their understanding of the possible. "It's not localized," the medic said. The pattern is systemic. Different ages, different causes, different mechanisms of damage. This isn't someone who's been hurt before. This is someone who has been returning to situations that involve serious harm repeatedly across." She paused. "I don't know how many years, a long time, a very long time." "Did you ask him?" He said. The medic hesitated. He said he stopped counting. Verath Saul went back into the room. Hale was sitting where she'd left him, jacket back on, looking approximately the same as he always looked. She sat across from him. "The 7 years," she said. "Yes. That's not where it started." "No," he said. "How long have you been doing this?" He looked at her steadily. The question was carrying more now, more history, more scar tissue, more of the thing the medic had found written into him in layers. "Since I was 17, he said. She did the math. He was 41. 24 years of returning to situations that involved serious harm. 24 years of scars accumulating in layers, of operational chains and pressure points and futures calculated and costs paid and hinged doors bent open, invented corridors at -40 degrees because the door needed to be open and there was no other way." "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Someone has to," he said. "Most people can't do this kind of thing and remain functional afterward. Most people sustain damage that removes them from the equation." A pause. "I don't." "Why not?" "I don't know," he said. And for the first time she heard something in his voice that she recognized from her own species' emotional register, not quite pain, but the specific texture of a question someone had stopped expecting to answer and had learned to simply carry. "I've tried to understand it. I've had people try to explain it to me. The best anyone's ever come up with is," he paused, "some people are built to stop." "Stop what?" He looked at her. His eyes were entirely calm, entirely certain, entirely quietly, devastatingly serious. "Everything," he said. "Whatever's coming, whatever the thing is that's coming that will make everything worse if it arrives. Some people are built to put themselves in front of that and stop it. And when it breaks you, then I heal," he said, "and I go back." The room was silent for a long time. "The syndicate," she said finally, because the conversation had reached a depth she didn't know how to continue into and there was still work to be done. "The data chip, is it finished?" "For now," he said. "They'll try again." "Yes. And you'll—" "Yes," he said. She looked at him, at the gray jacket, at the completely unremarkable face that the galaxy's entire security rating infrastructure had looked at and found not worth measuring, not worth indexing, not worth the space in the algorithm. At the man who had spent 24 years putting himself between things that were coming and people who couldn't stop them, accumulating damage in layers, healing, and going back. "Marcus," she said. "Yes. Thank you," he nodded once. The motion was small and complete, like a period at the end of a sentence, not dismissive but finished. Received. Filed in whatever place he kept the things that mattered. She filed her own report 8 months later, when the Karath Syndicate's internal investigation concluded, and 3 of its senior directors were removed by conclave sanction, and the political landscape her contracts operated within had shifted in ways that were going to take years to fully map. She filed it to the Galactic Security Brokers Exchange, specifically to the Methodology Review Board, specifically referencing the administrative footnote about the error code and the upper bound being undefined. She did not recommend that humans be added to the index. She recommended something different. She recommended that the index's fundamental architecture be reconsidered, that the assumption baked into every tier and ranking and certification, the assumption that predictability was a measure of capability, be re-examined from the ground up. Because what she had learned, over 8 months of watching Marcus Hale, was that the index had confused 2 different things. It had confused the appearance of stability with actual protective capacity. A bodyguard who always behaved consistently under pressure was a bodyguard who had found a behavior pattern that worked in the situations they had been trained for. A bodyguard who escalated without ceiling, who adapted without losing function, who absorbed damage and returned. That was something the index had no category for because the index had been built by civilizations that had never encountered it. Civilizations that had not been forged in whatever Marcus Hale had been forged in. The Methodology Review Board considered her report for 3 months. Their response was careful, diplomatic, and almost completely missed the point. They thanked her for the feedback. They acknowledged the edge case. They promised a review. She didn't follow up. The report wasn't really for them. It was for whoever came after, whoever would eventually look at the footage from the East Corridor, or the data from the 11 days of null biometric signal, or the medical file with its map of layered scars across an ordinary-looking man in a gray jacket, and ask the question she had asked on the first day and had spent 8 months learning the answer to. What is he? She knew now. Not completely. She suspected that no one knew completely, possibly including Hale himself. But she knew enough. He was the thing the galaxy had not thought to be afraid of, because the galaxy had built all its models of danger around the assumption that something dangerous looked dangerous, that a predator signaled its nature. That power announced itself. The galaxy had never fully reckoned with a species that had spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to survive by being underestimated. That had been prey long enough to learn every predator's blind spots and patient enough to remember them. That had built its entire civilization on the backs of individuals who, when everything was falling apart, when the mathematics of survival had shifted past the rational threshold, simply did not stop. Not because they couldn't perceive the cost, because they had decided, somewhere deep and wordless and long before the current situation arose, that the cost was acceptable, that the alternative was worse. The last time she saw him, he was in the corridor outside her office, not assigned to her anymore, the contracts having concluded, just there briefly because he had been in the building for another consultation and had stopped by. He was holding a datapad with something on it she didn't ask about. He looked exactly as he always looked. She asked him where he was going next. "Someone needs something stopped," he said. "Is it bad?" He considered the question with his particular, precise honesty. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." "And you're going to?" "Yes." She watched him walk down the corridor, the gray jacket, the entirely unremarkable silhouette, the walk of a person who knew exactly where they were going and had already accepted every cost of arriving there. The galaxy, she thought, was full of species that were stronger, species with more natural armor, more biological power, deeper histories of formal warfare, higher ratings on every index anyone had ever built. Species that could point to their military records and their augmentation statistics and their centuries of galactic combat documentation and say, "This is what dangerous looks like." None of them had a bodyguard who bent hinges and vented corridors at -40 degrees. None of them had someone who had stopped counting their scars. None of them had a man who, when asked why he kept going back into situations designed to end him, had said with the quiet certainty of a person reciting a fact they discovered long ago and had simply lived with ever since. Someone has to. The corridor was empty. He was already gone. She stood there for a moment longer, holding the question that had lodged like a splinter on the very first day. The question that every model and index and algorithm had failed to answer because they had all assumed the answer would be measurable, would be chartable, would fit inside a ranked system with an upper bound. And she understood, finally, that it didn't. That Marcus Hale, and whatever he was made of, and whatever the 7 blank years had contained, and whatever he was walking toward right now with the calm certainty of a stone in a riverbed, that was the answer. And the answer was not a number. It was not a rating. It was not a threat profile that any index in the galaxy had found a way to express. It was a species that had learned to look like prey, and had spent the entire time becoming something else entirely.